Maryam, I'm super excited to talk about your very non-linear career today and the opportunities that came out of that. But why don't we just start first with a revolution? Because I think that probably had a pretty pivotal impact on your trajectory and your life and the early stages, maybe even today. So can we start there in your story, and you can walk us through a little bit of the turbulence that came out of that and what that led to?
Yeah, sure. It's timely given what's happening in Iran today. I was in fifth grade, so 1978, when the revolution broke out. I went to an American school, and in the course of the year, clearly the class size got smaller and smaller. And then by the time I think the Shah left and Khomeini came, which was maybe like the February, March timeframe. After that, we left a few months after that, really as if we were going on vacation, because I don't know that anybody really understood what was happening. But it turned out to be a decision that was not, one that did not turn around. We went and ended up staying. So we first left and went to Paris, and then ended up migrating to California.
To California. Okay. So that's definitely some culture shock, I would imagine, right? Some culture shock and how did you process all that? Did you process all that?
I mean, you know what? I don't remember processing it, because you basically just moved and you got dropped in and you either curled up or survived. So I didn't really, particularly at that age, 11, 12, I don't know that I fully understood what was happening, but I was lucky to have been with my parents. So we weren't separated in that sense. And I'd gone to an American school, so I spoke English. So that wasn't totally that different. And I think I was fortunate because I had Western parents and I didn't have an accent. I think all those things sort of played a part. My parents also picked up and moved us to a town outside of San Francisco called Lafayette, where it was a pretty educated community, which I think was a purposeful decision on their part.
Yep.
That being said, people still had no idea where Iran was and asked you if you went to school on a camel. In sixth or seventh grade, I mean, I think I got here in junior high. So, most people were just focused on what was cool and wearing Izods and Calvin Klein jeans. So, you sort of just made your way.
But then the Iranian hostage crisis took place, and there was a big
hostage crisis happened, I think, before we got here in that year when we were in Paris. And then again, I think partly because, so we moved to Paris, and then when we landed in Iran, when we landed in Lafayette, I, at that point, was pretty fluent in French because I'd done a year in Paris in this intensive French program.
Right.
And so my first week of school, they put me in French 1 because, you're taught to be modest as an Iranian kid. And so when the principal said, "Do you speak French?" I said, "A little." And we left, and my mom said, "Why didn't you say you're fluent?" And I said, "Well, I didn't want to brag." So they put me in French 1, and I spoke more French than the French teacher. So that spread around the school pretty quickly. And I went to math class, and, maths outside of the US is more advanced, and they immediately sent me back to the principal's office. So they made me skip seventh grade. So I think I became sort of known as the foreign kid, AKA French brainiac. So there's many labels on me that, I think there were plenty, and the Iran one was one too, but I don't think people really registered. That being said, I do remember a kid calling me Khomeini or whatever, but it's a crazy story because my parents were bankers and my mom did marketing strategy in the TV station, but, they also were nonlinear because when we lived in Paris, as a way to sort of occupy herself, my mom and a friend of hers, a colleague of hers from the bank, from the TV station, actually decided to take a class to not just sit around worrying. So they took a baking class at Cordon Bleu. And then when we moved to Lafayette, my parents decided to open up a French bakery. God knows why, because they knew nothing about that. And my mom really hadn't spent that much time in the kitchen. So it must be the crazy must be in the genes. And so because we had a French bakery, because I'd been kicked out of French class, and we would have foreign exchange students who were French, and they'd be like, "Maryam, meet them." So, you were just an other. The other bucket was broad.
The other bucket was broad. And so and very cosmopolitan, right? So in some ways you were just teed up for this move. You were teed up for success, and then you had academic success and ended up in college. And then what happened there? Because I know there was a courageous decision that came with that.
Yeah. It's funny when I think about academic success, because I have two kids, one who's in college and one who's graduated. I think I never was the smartest kid in the class. I remember wanting to get into AP English and not being let in. I would, English was my second language.
Yeah.
And so, it wasn't like I was top of my class. I just didn't give up. And I think that, in some way that's like an immigrant story, right? Like you just kept at it. And so I think that was a big part of it. Like I ended up going to Barnard, but I tell people all the time I got off the wait list. So, I was successful in the sense that I ended up at a school, and I mean, I had good choices, Berkeley or Barnard, but my point is I wasn't like, top of my class first in line to get into Barnard. So I ended up there and have had a successful career, but it wasn't like I was an obvious choice out the gate.
No, but I love where you're going with that, because I think relentlessness is a lot of success, right? Never giving up, showing up, keeping at it. Yeah. And you graduated college, I think you didn't have a job, right? Is that correct?
Well, I mean, again, I think back about the revolution, I think like there was this sense of having seen people give their lives or losing their lives or, friends selling each other out to survive. Having that experience as an 11-year-old was pretty vivid because we didn't leave, before it all sort of broke out in the streets. And so you were seeing the papers with the dead bodies and all kinds of things as a kid. So I think there was a sense for me of, wanting to make a difference. Although even I think as a kid, there was something about serving that appealed to me, I think. Right. And so, I think like there was a sense of like, you only live once. So like, you got to make a difference and then like pick something you're passionate about. And I think my parents always said that to me themselves. So I think when I was graduating college, I wanted to not be tempted by the path that was easiest, which was what showed up on campus to recruit, which was banking and consulting. Right. And so I decided to, I think with a friend, we decided we'd take our last semester abroad. And then at the last minute, she bailed and I went, which is a common story in my path. A friend tells me about something, we decide to do it together. The 11th hour, they drop out. And I'm like, wait, I've signed up, so I keep going.
Interesting. Okay.
So I think that resilience or, also the sense that I'd already signed up, so I wasn't going to just like forfeit my money, it goes back like maybe financial insecurity, just like, I was going to go in and I was going to go all in.
And I love that.
Those things made a difference.
The words coming up for me is like, you've gone a lot of last miles by yourself. Not to get too philosophical, but you've gone a lot of last miles to get to where you want to go by yourself.
Well, it's funny. When I was in college, I remember I was on some committee and we were doing a party, and parties on campus at Barnard did not do well because we lived in New York. So people had the opportunity to go to the Palladium. You didn't necessarily want to go to a party on campus. And I remember coming up with an idea for a party on campus, and every night I would poster by myself. I mean, there was a committee and people would poster, but you could barely see the posters. And so every night as I went to bed and I noticed that the posters weren't there, I would get a pile and I would literally just go, putting them up myself every day. And so I think that sense of like, you were just going to will it to be was definitely something I had. I just was determined.
You've had a lot of success in marketing on SVP, C-level, board member. Looking back, obviously, we talked about your nonlinear path. Do you think that because of your diaspora, because of your experiences, because of the cosmopolitan atmosphere, maybe even some of the trauma, you connect dots differently? You just happen to look at the same picture, the same data, and just see something different than anyone else?
I think when you're an outsider, you see different things. I mean, I remember when I was at Univision, I was at a luncheon for one of our anchors who had written a book that one of the big imprints had published in Spanish. And I remember saying to Judith, who was the editor, what made you see this opportunity with the Hispanic market when it's so obvious and yet so many people don't? And she said, it's because I'm Australian. And I remember having that thought about like how when you come from the outside, the things that people take for granted or the patterns that are expected just add up differently for you. So I do think that made a difference, right? Because I saw things that people took for granted or didn't see because I was sort of a fresh set of eyes. And, I've had a lot of different companies that I've worked at in different roles. And I think when you come in with a fresh set of eyes, you do see new things. Now, you're not successful just because of that, because I do think a big part of it is also being humble enough and knowing how to bring people along the journey and work with the people who actually have the history and the knowledge that, comes with having been there for a long time. Right. So I also think as somebody who comes from the outside, if you have any sort of empathy or awareness, you also recognize that you don't know it all and that you actually have to come, it's a matter of coming together to find the pathway forward. I think, maybe having been taught to not, take the ball all the time, and take credit and sort of having to be humble, you sort of just were happy to bring a collective together. And that collective meant everybody had different superpowers, right? And that you could defer to other people instead of having to hog the ball.
I love that. I mean, it sounds like being the outsider, having a fresh pair of eyes, connecting different dots. That's a superpower. That sounds like one of your superpowers. Sounds like coalition building and alliance building is another one. Persuasion is probably in there as well. But on the superpower, was that something you were comfortable with initially, or did it take a couple of wins to say, you know what, I trust my instincts, I trust what I'm seeing?
I don't know if your superpower is in being an outsider per se, right? Probably your superpower is like more of a skill set. I think it's sort of a circumstance.
Okay.
Because I think you can develop that sense of being an outsider by being just curious and fearless, right?
Interesting. Yeah.
When I think about having taken the job at Nextdoor, right? I had gone from working at a global company, a board level job, which of course it was a board level job at Nextdoor too, but the scale was just seismically different, right? From 400 people to 100,000 people, from tons of resources to startup.
Yeah,
I think, a lot of people would have thought like that was just a crazy jump. And also a new industry, right? Going from hospitality now to tech. And so I think, that willingness to be uncomfortable and to be willing to say, I don't know, like I would go into meetings and I'd be like, I don't know those words that you're using.
Interesting.
And, a lot of people would be uncomfortable with that because especially as you get more senior, you're supposed to have all the answers. For me, I think I was always sort of comfortable enough to raise my hand and say like, I don't know what you're saying. And not in a mean way, just like I wasn't familiar with the lingo, right? I was like, what is Dow, wow, and Mao? Like, where's the glossary so that I can participate?
Right. And the confidence then to go source the genius from others and enroll them in the vision and give them credit and fingerprint it and so forth. Is that correct?
I think, I always cared about the collective, right? I think I found Jim Collins's work good to great when I was at Univision. I really believed in that. I used to say I wanted to be on the bus. People would be like, why don't you want to be CEO? It's not that I didn't want to be CEO. I think it goes back to my childhood, which is like, in Iran, we all had big families. My happiest memories was when the house was full, right? Like lots of food, lots of friends and family. And then you were sort of plucked out where we lived in a suburb, which was a well-to-do suburb, which basically meant people lived separate lives right behind bushes. And so it was much more isolating, besides the fact that you were from the outside, right? I mean, it's not that they weren't welcoming, just when people have hedges, you're just more separate.
That's right.
And so I think for me, this idea of wanting to find belonging in community was like something I clearly was trying to replicate unconsciously almost from my childhood. And so I think as a result of that, I wasn't obsessed with being the head person. I wanted to be part of a team.
What type of challenges, given the breadth of experience you've had now, what type of challenges excite you? Would you go back to a similar problem that you solved before? Or are you now looking for something new? Like, how do you discern opportunity, challenge, where to spend your time?
Well, I mean, before I took the Nextdoor job, I used to say I'd sort of come up with a 4-box, like, can I learn something? Can I have impact? Do I respect the people I get to work with? And do I believe in the product or the service or whatever? I think, having done Nextdoor, and again, each job, I mean, the wisdom comes from experience, right? I think, and also just asking yourself the questions. I think by the time I did Nextdoor and New York City was under a lot of pressure, again, I say New York is a city that gave me voice and an incredible feeling of belonging because of its diversity, right? It's the first place that I really felt like I belonged. So when the city got under pressure, even though I was at a 24/7 startup job, I said to my husband and some friends, and we all were like, how can we help? And so we ended up starting this nonprofit and this grassroots movement. And in doing that, like this incredibly purposeful, like side hustle, we also sort of found meaning, community, and joy, right? And so for me, I think one of the big questions I now think about a lot. And it's kind of a privilege to be able to be in this position to even ask these questions. So I'm clear on that, right? As a kid who had student loans and had to make certain decisions to just pay her bills. So I'm not, unaware of that, but I sort of think how much is enough? What is enough? How many rungs do you need? How much money do you need? And at what point do you really think about making a difference, right? Yeah. And so, sometimes people call me about a job and they say you can make a lot of money. Well, money was never the thing that drove me. I mean, I definitely had financial insecurity and I wanted to pay my bills, but that's not what motivates me. So for me, it's always about can I have an impact and do I believe and can I make a difference, right? And so, right now I'm working on a project to help reignite pride in New York, really like a marketing project, a new version of I Love New York. And I think I deeply, deeply care about New York, and I deeply believe in the diversity of the people and this idea of bringing people together to find a pathway forward. It is a complicated hairball idea, right? And so, and not a small one, because there's 8 million people in New York. But I think that challenge, but also just that belief, right? That it's a time, somebody said to me, sometimes it's just the time to serve. And so I sort of feel sometimes an environment or opportunity presents itself, and our cities in particular need us to help solve some of the problems. It's not just going to happen by one entity. It really is going to require us all coming together at all levels and frankly, making room for the younger generation to participate.